Sunday, March 16, 2014. The Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men. In one of those videos I watched on Friday, Darren Brown was asked by two interviewers whether things sometimes went wrong. He admitted they did. Of course, he didn't elaborate. And you didn't get to see any of the footage of the things going wrong. That would have spoiled it for everyone, I suppose. If things could go wrong for Darren, they were inevitably going to go wrong for people like Dan and me, especially given the sheer number of variables we were facing. Dan likes to talk of chaos theory, and I suppose that's at the core of everything. For things to have gone exactly to plan, we'd have needed to impose order on what is essentially a disordered universe. Obviously, that was never going to happen. We were taking a calculated risk, but no matter how much we calculated, in the end, we were still throwing dice, hoping that certain numbers wouldn't come up. Unfortunately, one of them did. You're probably well aware that Dan didn't have a car here in Melbourne. With that in mind, I guess it's hardly surprising he's barely mentioned a garage in this account. It seems he'd only ever been in it twice. The first time was when he was exploring the place at the very beginning. The second time was when he needed a larger broom to deal with the debris following Ian's assault on Tuesday night. The garage is a great setup, really. It's what I'd like for my dream home. You get to it via the little service lane behind the building, and from the garage there is a door which leads you straight into the kitchen. You don't have to drag your shopping very far. How handy. Anyway, on this particular afternoon, Dan had left the garage open and was waiting, just inside the kitchen doorway, the remote controller for the roller in one hand, the gun held behind his back in the other. I was lurking farther back in the hallway. The plan was to get Ian out of the car and let him walk into the kitchen, then pull the gun out, in case he was wanting to become violent. From there we would escort him down to the studio, where we'd left the money. The first is pretty much exactly what happened. Ian drove in at almost exactly 5 p.m. I saw his Mercedes pull into the laneway, pause outside the garage, and cautiously drive in. Dan, who was watching from just inside the kitchen, closed the roller door just as soon as the car had entered. Ian stepped out and sneered. "What's the deal with you closing up behind me, Djurdjevic?" "I want to ensure privacy." "Why? Is the money hot?" "It's cash, so why do you care?" Ian snorted and walked towards the kitchen, arms outstretched. "This has to be the shittiest welcome I've ever had. Normally people come out to greet their visitors. Still scared, eh, Djurdjevic? Want to keep your distance?" "Can you blame me?" Ian only realized something was amiss when he walked into the kitchen itself. Dan had stepped back a few meters, then he pulled out the gun. "Ho, ho, ho, ho! A gun! Silencer, too! You really are a typical Melbourne wog, aren't you? Going all mafia on me. Now I'm starting to see why you're so cagey about your private life. This money you've got is tied to organised crime, isn't it?" "Never you mind." "What are you planning to do? Shoot me?" Ian was advancing and Dan was walking backwards. "Only if I have to, and believe me, if you step any closer, I will." Dan raised the gun and aimed. Luckily, Ian stopped in his tracks. "I don't get you. I really don't. You're bonkers, stark raving mad. You say you want to give me money, and now you're pointing a gun at me, one that has a fucking silencer." "You'll get your money all right. This gun is just insurance." "Ah, it's for your cowardice. And I see your whore is also here to back you up." By this time, Ian had seen me standing in the hallway. "Oh, well, we might as well get it over and done with. Where's this money you've promised?" That's when the whole thing went pear-shaped. The doorbell rang. "Were you expecting company?" asked an incredulous Ian. "No. Justine, would you see who it is?" I was already heading towards the door. I looked through the peephole. "Who is it?" asked Dan. "It's Zah and Silvio." "Get rid of them. Make—" Dan started saying. But as I turned around, I saw him taking his eyes off Ian. Just for a second, Ian took his opportunity to lunge forward and grab the silencer, push the gun to one side, and punch Dan in the face. All about the same time, I felt sick as I saw blood spurt out. Then both men crashed heavily to the floor. It was only a split second later that Ian was sitting astride Dan, trying to wrestle the gun out of his fingers. I could see that both men had only one hand on the gun. Ian was using his free hand to try to punch Dan in the face. Dan was using his free hand to try not to get punched. Meanwhile, the gun was being twisted this way and that. I was worried it was going to go off. So I did the only thing I could think of. I opened the door. Silvio virtually fell in as I did so. "Jesus Christ!" he shouted, seeing the carnage. For a brief moment, he and Tsar, who was carrying his Dell notebook over his shoulder, just stood there stunned, watching the two men wrestling. Then, very calmly and methodically, my little brother walked up, took his laptop off his shoulder and raised it high above his head and brought it down heavily on Ian's skull. It looked like he did the last part with as much force as he could muster. I heard the shattering of glass and plastic inside the case. By this point, Ian had freshly wrestled the gun out of Ian's hand. Thankfully, he hadn't yet had a chance to point it. He went down as soon as the computer struck him, hitting the ground with his already bruised face. I doubt he passed out completely, but he was certainly dazed. He lay there without moving for a second or two, before he started stirring and moaning. Dan took the gun and scrambled backwards. His nose was bleeding profusely. "For God's sake, get some tissues!" I yelled to Silvio, who ran to the toilet, the one where Tsar had collapsed a couple of weeks before, and grabbed a whole roll of toilet paper which he thrust towards Dan. As he accepted the roll, Dan gave the gun over to Tsar, saying, "Shoot him if he gets up." Then he scrunched up a big wad of the paper and held it against his nose. I actually felt sad to see that his pinstriped shirt was wrecked again. It's funny how both Dan and I thought it would make a nice touch if he dressed up in the exact same clothes he was wearing on Tuesday when Ian assaulted him. Some would say that was bound to be unlucky. Eventually Ian picked himself up onto his knees, his body swaying slightly. Like Dan, he had blood on his face, just a lot less. No doubt he had reopened the wounds in his mouth. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed, looking at my brother, who had the gun aimed at his head. "Stand back a bit, Tsar. You don't want a repeat of what just happened to me," said Dan through the toilet paper. "Besides, we've run out of laptops." Tsar moved back just as Dan suggested. Then he shouted, "You bastard! That had all my TAFE work on there. I should shoot you right now. Get fucked, smackhead." I noticed how slurred Ian's voice was, and how much he was still swaying. I could also see blood oozing out the back of his skull, where Tsar's notebook had connected. Dan tore off a small piece of the toilet paper, rolled it up and stuffed it into one nostril. The bridge of his nose was starting to swell. I wondered if it was broken. The paper certainly made it look even worse, distorting his whole face so that he looked like Stallone at one of the end of his Rocky movies. "Justine, grab the roll of bin liners, make a pass to the trapdoor." I understood him at once. Dan wanted the kitchen bin bags rolled out like a carpet, presumably to stop blood and DNA making a trail to the hidden studio. So I ran to the kitchen, found the liners in the bottom drawer next to the sink, and unfurled the long line of plastic all the way to the laundry. "Get up, Ian. Time to claim your money." Dan took the gun from Tsar, pulled the slide back to load a cartridge. From what little I know of guns, I guess this means it hadn't even been set to fire. "Come on, McRae, on your feet." When Ian didn't move, Dan walked up and kicked him as hard as he could in the stomach. I could hear Ian gasp, and he fell forwards again. "Ugh! Ugh!" "If you don't move, I'm going to have to kick you again." That seemed to do the trick, because somehow Ian got to his feet. He was teetering slightly. "Walk!" barked Dan. Ian did as he was told. "So what now, Djurdjevic? Planning to finish me off?" Ian said this without looking back. "Not at all. I'm just house-proud. I don't want your disgusting blood everywhere." Ian was now walking in front of Dan. He took his blood-soaked hand and wiped it on the kitchen wall. Knowing him, he did it to make a point. But Dan's response was brutal. He kicked him from behind, a massive soccer kick up into his testes, and Ian collapsed again in agony. That was for Justine, by the way. I hoped I kicked you hard enough. And please don't do the blood smearing thing again. I told you I don't want the house dirtier than it already is, particularly not with your bodily fluids. Ian was on his knees, coughing. Suddenly he vomited on the white plastic. Mostly bile and some ugly diced carrot stuff too. If you don't get a move on, I'll kick you again. After a few seconds, Ian waved a hand in defeat. I think it's the first time I've ever seen him surrender anything at all. He slowly raised himself and tottered forwards along the bin-lined pathway towards the laundry. Ian wasn't finding it easy to get through the little trapdoor without touching the sides. He's a big man, but Dan kept barking at him. I could barely recognize his voice at times because it was so nasal from the tissue stuffed into his nose. When we all finally got into the basement, I thought Ian had recovered some of his wits. He certainly wasn't swaying anymore. Dan pointed to the recording booth with one hand while keeping the handgun pointed directly at him. Your money's in there, McRae. Go in, count it, then get out. You're one mad motherfucker, you know that, said Ian, shaking his head, then turning slowly towards the booth. I watched Dan as he went to the screen and prodded the mouse. Then I saw him click the record and null button. This was just before Ian opened the door to the booth, walked in, and allowed the door to close slowly behind him. For a moment it seemed like Ian was about to bend over to examine the suitcase, and suddenly he was gone. Hey, where's Ian? Asked Silvio. Don't worry, he'll be back, said Dan. I'll have to let Justine explain it to you all when this is all over. But right now we've got a lot of work to do, and since you're both here, I'll need one of you to do a bit of lifting. Dan flicked what I presume was the safety switch on the gun and put it on the bench top. Then he grabbed the plastic overgarment and some gloves, stuff he told me he had bought at the Red Spot in Perth, and threw it all to Tsar. Here, you can help me, he said. Looking at Dan, I wondered if he shouldn't sit this one out. The swelling on his nose was getting worse, so I said, Dan, maybe Silvio and Tsar can do it. I mean, they're both here, and you're not looking too good. I'm fine. Besides, we only have one plastic outfit. I don't want the boys' DNA on the rug. My DNA doesn't matter. He had a good point. As Tsar started putting on the plastic gear, Dan went to the computer and printed a profile. Of course, I already knew what it was. It was the copy of his corpse from Tuesday night. So what's in the carpet, man? Feels like a body. Tsar was breathing hard as he exited the stairwell into the laundry. It is. Whose? Mine. Fuck off. I'm serious. It's too hard to explain right now, but in a nutshell, Ian killed me on Tuesday. This is my body. Dan was also breathing hard. I'm a copy. The booth in the studio is a kind of 3D printer. You've taken some sort of drug, haven't you? Either that or you're making a very sick joke. I was walking in front of them listening. I said, It's all true, Tsar. I'll explain it later. Sylvia had opened the rear hatch of Ian's car and was releasing the boot screen as we got there. It took a while to get Dan's former body into Ian's booth. Luckily, it was still fresh and pliable. As Dan said later, it had been dead for an hour at most, and apparently rigor mortis doesn't set in for at least 3. I watched as Dan and Tsar pushed and pulled. It looked like the problem wasn't the body, it was the rug. It was stiff and awkward to position, particularly with both ends covered in plastic. I have to say I was very glad for the plastic covering. I don't think I could have stood seeing Dan's dead body again. In the end, they did it, of course. Poor Dan was covered in sweat, and his nose had started bleeding again. Once we were done, Silvio pulled the screen back down to cover the evidence and closed the hatch. Back down in the studio, Dan got Tsar to shed all his plastic gear and throw it into the booth. Then Dan erased it all. The 2 boys watched it all in stunned silence. After that, Dan said, "Okay, fellas, ready for Ian's big comeback?" They said nothing, so Dan double-clicked on Ian's profile, and just like that, the big man was back in the booth, stooping to look into the briefcase as if nothing had happened. Less than a minute later, he came out holding a rolled-up wad of notes. This is bullshit, Djurdjevic. I've counted it. It's a miserable 25,000. Where's the other 250k you promised? Tsar, Silvio and I followed behind Dan as he walked into the main studio, still pointing the gun at Ian. Change of plans, buddy. We've decided to give you only 50,000. You got half yesterday, this is the other half. You cat-fisting, rotten little bastard! You dragged me out here, point a gun at me, smack my head, bloody my lip again, and all of it was just for this? He shook the wad of money angrily. I could see blood on the notes. Yep, that's about the size of it. Take it or leave it. Either way, it's time for you to get the hell out of here. I'll take your money, all right, but if you think the deal is still on, you've got another thing coming. Of course, Dan and I already knew that the deal was never on. Ian doesn't work that way. I'm going to go home, put an ice pack on my head, pour a glass of wine, call Susan, and we're going to spend the rest of the night, make that the week, working out exactly how to take you down. I'm going to kill you, you know that? You've already done that, Ian, said Dan, stepping to one side to let him walk up the stairwell. Ian just snorted and headed for the exit. We followed. I opened the garage door while Dan, who had already put the gun away, waited with crossed arms at the entrance to the kitchen. I almost laughed to see Silvio and Tsar looking from behind like kids. Ian reversed, gave us all the middle finger, and drove off. After that, Dan got even more businesslike. He checked his wristwatch and said, "Okay, time to get cracking. Only 15 minutes until Mrs. Chu gets home. Boys, help me pick up all the plastic and take it to the basement. Justine, grab some bleach and wipe all the surfaces approaching the laundry and basement trapdoor. Leave any blood that's in the kitchen and hallway. The cops need to find that evidence." Within 5 minutes it was all done. We watched as Dan erased the plastic sheeting, cleaning products, the gun, and sadly, the wreckage that was Tsar's laptop, all in the blink of an eye. "Right then, show's over, folks." Dan turned to my brother. "Justine was originally going to catch a tram home, but since you're here, I want you to drive her back to your place. You guys need to leave as soon as possible. We're running out of time." "Sure." "I'll let Just explain everything, but for now, please remember, this whole thing is a secret you have to keep forever. Got it? As for today, none of you have been here. Silvio, you were last here on Monday night. Justine and Tsar, you guys last saw me on Wednesday night for dinner." We all nodded. "Finally, remember to leave the front door ajar. I want Mrs. Chu and the police to be able to get in easily." Dan stuck his hand out to Silvio first. "It's been good knowing you, my friend. Hopefully we'll catch up again sometime." Silvio seemed dumbstruck. He took Dan's hand uncertainly. Then he embraced him in a tight hug. "Hey, watch the nose," laughed Dan. "See you later, boss," said Silvio as they parted. Suddenly Dan reached into his pocket. "That reminds me, this is for you." He pulled out his analog watch, the mirror image version. "I remember how much you liked this when we first met, so I made a copy. I was going to get Justine to give it to you, but since you're here. Anyway, I hope it didn't get smashed up in all the fighting." "No, it seems fine," said Silvio as he examined the timepiece. "Wow, thanks, man." Then Dan turned to Tsar. "Buddy, let's not make this the end. I'll be seeing you. I don't know where or when, but count on it." "Are you going to be erasing yourself?" "Yes, but I'll also be printing myself to another place where I can start over. Who knows? When everything has died down and assuming we don't have to decommission the 3D printer here permanently, maybe I'll be back. We can all have dinner together. I look forward to it." Tsar and Dan hugged. It was my turn. "Call me," I said, kissing him, trying to avoid his swollen nose. "I will." He smiled. I last saw him as we drove off. He was on his mobile dialing first Mrs. Chu to see Ian had arrived and was being aggressive, and then 000 a few minutes later to say an intruder had broken into his house. Finally, everything was happening as we had planned. We drove home in total silence. Tsar and Silvio seemed to understand that I wasn't in the mood to talk. A couple of police cars drove past us with sirens blaring, heading towards Prince's Hill. No doubt an APB was also out for a Mercedes M-Class belonging to a certain Ian McRae. Mrs. Chu would have reported his number plate once she got through the open door, to find Dan missing and blood in the hallway and kitchen. And of course, once found, Ian's car would have a dead body in the boot, with Ian's DNA all over it. I felt hot tears in my eyes, and my vision started to blur. Abruptly I began to sob. "You okay, Joss?" said Zah, who was at the wheel. I nodded, but carried on sobbing. Yes, I was okay, finally. Everything was going to be okay from now on.